Welcome to the Gary Null Show, a program designed to enhance mental, physical, and spiritual well-being through science and the wisdom of the ages. Let us take you on a journey of empowerment. Sit back, relax, and get ready to change your life for good.
Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null, and as you can see, we're not in studio, we're out on location again. For those of you who tune in to watch our program on health and nutrition, well, we have a big program. It's in 4 parts. I'm taking you all over the world to show you the latest information in a continuing odyssey on challenging the HIV equals AIDS hypothesis. In this challenge, you're going to be hearing from people from Australia and New Zealand, from France and Germany, from Ireland and England and the United States and Mexico, who are saying, we've had it all wrong. That our entire war on AIDS has been misdirected, much like our war on cancer. So let's go out now and take apart this myth of AIDS, step by step, using some of the finest minds in science, journalism, public health, nurses, clinicians, activists, and journalists.
It destroys people's immune systems, but there are other things that can lead to quicker deaths. And I think it's one of many viruses that are out there that people can succumb to.
If you were to ask me, does HIV cause AIDS? The answer is undoubtedly yes.
I'm pretty certain that HIV is the causative factor in AIDS.
I truly believe that I had an infectious virus that was going to kill me.
Whether it's people I'm afraid to tell, or media reports that come back HIV equals death, that has been far harder for me to deal with on every level than I think the HIV in my system.
Your doctor will look very sorrowfully at you and say, "You have just tested positive for the AIDS virus. You are going to die."
And he says, "You're one of 4 patients who is a positive carrier of HIV. I said, what does that mean in time? And he says, anywhere from 2 to 4 years.
I warned that this was going to be something that was going to far transgress and transcend the so-called risk group that it was in now, that it was something that might become a rather global problem, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened.
The majority believe that AIDS is becoming a pandemic, that this was predicted, and that this is so, that AIDS is spreading by heterosexual transmission throughout the general population.
I feel that the major scientific journals of the world have failed to allow the critics of the HIV hypothesis a proper forum.
I'm quite confident that quite soon people will realize that there's a vast body of knowledge about AIDS and HIV which has been withheld from them.
It has always been known to have multifactorial causes before the rewriting of science.
AIDS is not a gay disease, it's a lifestyle disease, yes, absolutely.
I think the cause of AIDS is different in different risk groups.
There's absolutely no evidence that there's an epidemic of AIDS anywhere in the world.
The principal arbiter in this, as in any other long-term medical problem, is not the ability or agility of the scientists, it's the passage of time.
The HIV antibody test is a very bad test. We're going to make a lot of money off this. Everybody in the world is going to have to take this test to find out who's going to die of the plague.
The AZT has been discredited by some of the leading experts in the field.
AZT and so-called antiviral therapies cause the very disease they're supposed to prevent.
Bactrim and AZT cause many of the symptoms we associate with AIDS.
But there was never really, to my mind, I've looked at this very closely now, evidence of a new virus actually being isolated.
Do I still even believe that HIV exists? And I'm beginning to think no.
They have never come up with a plausible explanation for how HIV kills T cells.
The dogma that HIV is a cruel, relentless killer is palpably wrong.
There's absolutely no AIDS epidemic anywhere unless you define an epidemic as a few cases trickling in here and there, which I don't. It certainly has never lived up to the gross exaggerations and the hysteria that has been generated on the issue of AIDS.
Not only haven't the predictions come true, but it's comical. We're in San Diego County, there's 2.5 million people. We have an epidemic with a total number of AIDS cases of 7,000, that's in 15 years. There's 57 heterosexual men with AIDS out of a potential 1 to 1.2 million. In the 1985, they told us that there were 1 to 2 million Americans that were positive. Now the number is down to 600,000. This is extremely troubling if we feel a scientific theory rises or crashes based on the validity of its predictions.
Of all the predictions given in the 1980s about AIDS, very few, if any, have come true. First, we were told that it was not harmful to medical personnel. Then we were told that medical personnel was highly at risk. We were told that it would affect only the gay community. Then we were told that women were the most afflicted. We were told that the intensive research for drugs and vaccines would yield satisfactory results. We haven't seen any. In fact, all we have seen is a large lie.
Since the first cases appeared, the epidemic has become a battleground, pitting various groups one against the other. We have had all forms of scientific dispute. It won celebrity as a human rights cause, as a lawyer's bonanza, and as a media sensation. In its short career, AIDS has become the most talked about, anxiety-laden, and fiercely contested and lavishly resourced event of modern times. If the prestige of disease is ranked by the resources allocated for care and therapy and development and research, then AIDS is the most prestigious disease ever.
I think, like myself in that second half of the 80s, it was a great story, and we took it on board as a kind of public health emergency too. And that's a danger for any group of professionals, whether they're media workers or scientists, to get too close to the sort of propagandizing that happened with AIDS. We lost our sense of judgment, I'm afraid, on this issue, because we felt that sense of fear and urgency. It was like a war. And in those circumstances, the critical judgment went out of the window, I'm afraid, for too many of us.
There's absolutely no evidence that there's an epidemic of AIDS anywhere in the world, whether you consider the percentage of the American gay population that supposedly have AIDS has always been and will always be probably about 2% of the gay population. It has never increased. We are constantly told that the gay community is being decimated by an infectious disease, yet that the numbers don't hold out.
Both in America and in Australia, that they have recognized that there is no general epidemic of AIDS spreading to the general population, and they too have also acknowledged in print that the epidemic is overfunded.
We've been led to believe that the HIV diagnosis automatically is an AIDS death sentence. What is the proof of this?
I think Peter Duesberg stimulated us to think more deeply and really led us to reaffirm that the evidence was very strong and becoming stronger, that HIV was the genuine cause of AIDS and that you don't get AIDS without HIV.
Dr. Robert Gallo, director of the Laboratory for Tumor Cell Biology at the National Cancer Institute, made world headlines in April 1984 as the discoverer of the AIDS virus. The media rejoiced that the path to vaccine prevention of AIDS was open and that a vaccine will likely be ready for trial in 2 or 3 years. His contribution did not end there. Dr. Gallo devised a test for the presence of the virus and mastered the art of growing the virus in the large quantities needed for research. The worldwide conviction that HIV is the cause of AIDS dates from this moment.
But there was never really, to my mind, I've looked at this very closely now, evidence of a new virus actually being isolated in the way that I've been taught is needed to be sure that you have a specific agent that is responsible for this condition. Because of those difficulties and because the interpretation of what was called isolation of HIV was actually indirect and rested on a number of indirect measures, the HIV test never got properly validated, and I think that this has been the root of the whole problem.
There are so many things that are completely wrong about the HIV, the virus AIDS hypothesis. I mean, for example, if HIV is such a deadly infectious virus, why is it that the partners of people who are positive don't get HIV and don't get AIDS? I mean, it's very, very rare that anyone living with a person with AIDS or HIV has become infected, so to speak. And the wives of haemophiliacs who are HIV positive, a tiny proportion were said to have become infected, which was less than what you would normally expect in that group of people in the community as a whole, okay? So the whole business of infection is wrong.
Do you believe that HIV is the cause of AIDS?
No, I don't think HIV is the cause of AIDS. I've really studied the issue quite a bit, and it seems to me like retroviruses don't really have much power to cause harm. We have studied retroviruses, but HIV in particular has never been clearly defined in terms of its genetic structure and its molecular structure. And what I mean by that is that you can try to determine the genetic sequence of HIV from one person and compare it to another person, or even different viruses in the same person's body, and you'll find that there are huge variations in their genetic sequences. And now we're starting to talk about different strains and mutations and all this stuff. What that really means is that nobody's really sure exactly what HIV is, what the exact genetic sequence is, and some scientists out there are not even sure if HIV really exists as a definite microorganism.
The problem in trying to make AIDS related to a single cause is that it has always been known to have multifactorial causes before the rewriting of science. The opportunistic infections, which are indicative of the AIDS syndrome, and it is a syndrome with multiple faces, has always been known to have prior causes before the discovery or invention of the viral reasoning. PCP pneumonia had been tied in with malnutrition and chemotherapy. KS was named after Carposi, a dermatologist in the late 19th century who observed this in syphilis, and on and on and on.
You see, the irony is that was the first thing that was accepted. That's why it's called acquired immune deficiency syndrome. You had acquired it by some kind of a lifestyle, by some kind of practices associated with your lifestyle. It became only infectious really in 1985 or 84 when Dr. Gallo, our friend Dr. Gallo, discovered the so-called cause of AIDS, the human immune deficiency virus, which actually had been discovered by Montagnier a year earlier. But before then it was largely considered a non-infectious disease acquired by lifestyles and clinical risks, behavioral and clinical risks. And I would say that is what it is, and that is what it has remained in the last 8 or 10 years ever since we know AIDS.
The leading science writer in the world, for years the chief science writer for the Times of London, is Neville Hodgkinson. And Neville was one of those individuals, as you will hear, who staunchly believed that everything we've been told about AIDS was correct, that HIV was the cause, until he did something that was unique and different from other journalists. He looked at the evidence, and having a background in science, he studied the evidence so carefully that he finally began to disprove the myth. These are his views now.
In 1991, that was the first that I heard that a different way of looking at the causes of AIDS had been put forward by Professor Peter Duesberg. I had missed this story. He had published on this in 1987. I didn't know anything about that paper until 1991. And when I first heard that there was a different way of looking at it, I was concerned. It was like a threat to a lot of the reporting that I'd done, and I didn't like to feel that I was going to have to change tack on something that I'd invested so much time and energy and so much reporting from that point of view. So when I was told that there was this different perspective, I was resistant to it. And I hoped that I'd be able to dismiss it. And I had a bit of space in early 1992 where I was able to read in more detail the literature, the challenge that Duesberg and one or two others had made to the conventional view, and to see what had been said in response. And to my surprise, I found that there'd been an enormous amount of abuse with which his arguments had been greeted, either ignored or abusive response, but that actually nobody really grappled with the points that he was making. And that made me feel that perhaps there was something here that was worth putting before the public.
He thought that HIV could not possibly cause AIDS because retroviruses were never known to kill cells. It's only when AIDS came along that all of a sudden they started saying that a retrovirus, HIV, was killing cells.
Professor Kary Mullis is one of the most unique minds in America. He won the Nobel Prize. Well, Dr. Mullis believes, well, I'm not going to tell you what he believes. You can hear for himself. He's a very unusual person. We did this interview late at night at his home on the ocean.
The people that are AIDS researchers now are getting neurotic if you ask them any questions. There was a time when I first started asking questions, all I wanted was, where are the papers? Just tell me the papers that you read that convinced you that HIV was the cause of AIDS, because I need to reference those papers in some of the, I was working on a test for HIV with PCR, and I needed to write a little report to the NIH to say, here's the progress we've made, and the first line of it was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I thought that was true. This is before I got involved. And I said, what's the reference for that quote? And I looked for it for about 2 or 3 years, and I never could find it. And by the end of 2 years, I'd ask everybody at every meeting that I'd gone to that talked about AIDS, I'd ask, I'd look through every computer database. There is no reference. There is nobody who should get credit for that statement. Now that's a pretty weird situation in science, where getting credit for a discovery is the most important thing in your life as a scientist.
This agent just hasn't passed the very first tests for a pathogenic agent. And of course, this was what Peter Duesberg pointed out in his 1987 paper, his first to demonstrate and draw together the evidence that demonstrated very, very clearly that if HIV existed, it could not be found at all easily, even in the bodies of AIDS patients, let alone those who tested HIV positive. He pointed out that with most infectious illnesses, you have billions of virus particles present in small quantities of blood and elsewhere in the body of a person, especially those with active disease. But that even in AIDS, HIV couldn't be isolated directly from the bodies of these patients. What you had to do was take samples from the patients, kickstart them with stimulants for the immune cells, mix them with cells from other people, and eventually you could get something out. But it wasn't isolatable in any conventional sense. And it really should have been basic science that told people that the HIV theory was deeply flawed.
I feel that there is no scientific evidence to prove that HIV is either the primary or any of the causes of AIDS because no appropriate tests have been done. Now, HIV is a virus that is present in a lot of AIDS patients, but that does not make it the primary cause.
You could predict, and I did predict, that the outbreak of AIDS in Britain and even in New York City, which was one of the original epicenters of AIDS when it started, even there, AIDS would follow a predictable course of increase among men, especially in high-risk groups. It is still mainly 90% a disease of men in high-risk groups.
I think the cause of AIDS is different in different risk groups. For gay men, for example, we have to have one thing very clear. Only a very small group of gay men are affected by AIDS. If you play with the statistics, you come down with less than 3% of the American male homosexual population is affected by HIV, not even AIDS. And that's less than gay men dying every year of heart disease, drug-related issues. But in a certain minority group amongst gay men, and certainly as far as we could trace it down, the early AIDS cases qualified as such, certain behavior could clearly cause the two diseases that were initially the AIDS-defined diseases, PCP and KS.
If you were to challenge the HIV hypothesis, what parts of it would you challenge as being unsupportable?
Well, they say that HIV is the singular cause of AIDS. Yet the original AIDS-defining disease was Kaposi sarcoma, which is a very unusual form of cancer, which was occurring amongst gay men. However, if you check the figures out, there isn't a single case of Kaposi sarcoma in any British haemophiliacs or American haemophiliacs. There are no cases in blood transfusion recipients. There are no cases in IV drug users. But these people have HIV, but they do not develop Kaposi sarcoma. So the diseases that the different risk groups are dying of are different. So this means that HIV itself is not the cause of Kaposi sarcoma, and Kaposi sarcoma was the original AIDS-defining disease. Robert Gallo, Anthony Fauci, Baltimore, and everybody admit HIV is not the singular cause of AIDS because they admit HIV is not the cause of Kaposi sarcoma.
There are many things out there to suggest that HIV has got something to do with AIDS, but I know too many people that have been HIV infected for 10 to 15 years that have gotten no diseases or no consequences because of it. So I think the question is still open.
It's extraordinarily difficult to become infected with HIV. You have to have a very special receptor on your cells. This was only recently, the New York Times put this out last week, that some work was done where they found that you need another protein called fusin so that HIV could actually infect the cell. So the fact is, unless there is something that people can take to make them susceptible to HIV that could mimic this fusin so that HIV can infect cells. The cells are not so easily infected.
Is this the most studied virus ever?
Absolutely. 60,000 papers have been published on it just earlier last year. 60,000. That's 6 papers for every little nucleotide that's in that virus. That is orders of magnitude more than on polio, on measles, on mumps, on all viruses combined.
And yet we still cannot prove that it explodes and is massive to the population.
Or that it causes AIDS, for that matter.
I don't think there's just one weakness in the HIV equals AIDS equals death hypothesis, but one of the central ones has got to be, by any intelligent estimation, the non-specificity of the antibody test. It's getting to the point where I'm feeling genuinely weary of hearing people say that HIV is spreading, when what they mean is testing is spreading, and the testing is non-specific. Non-specificity of the antibody test, the fact that the antibodies that are detected by Western blot or by ELISAs cannot be specifically related to a virus, when after 12 years and how many $1 billion they certainly ought to be able to be, means that there must be some questions that are not being addressed.
In the case of the HIV tests that are routinely manufactured and licensed in developed countries, the ones that I have seen or examined the credentials or use in my lab are highly specific to HIV. They do not cross with related viral genomes that all of us humans do have in our body, and they do not cross with tuberculosis.
Big problem with the ELISA test, which is the main one used in the States, is that it's highly inaccurate. Many things can throw up a positive ELISA test, glandular fever, other viruses, even sperm. So many people can be labeled HIV positive and given a death sentence, in a sense, when they don't have the virus. The other test, the Western blot test, is just as inaccurate. But it's been found that in one study, it was determined that although some hundreds of thousands of people were tested positive with the HIV ELISA test, with the Western blot, they found only some hundred actually had the presence of antibodies.
The HIV antibody test is a very bad test. I believe that it is one of the worst frauds committed on the American public in the century. Well, just about everybody believes that if you get one of these tests, it will actually tell you whether or not you are infected with HIV, and if it's positive, that that's some kind of a prediction of whether or not you'll get AIDS. And that is absolutely not true. First of all, a positive result on that test doesn't mean that you're infected with HIV, and there is no way that it can mean that. There's a basic scientific principle that most people are totally ignoring, and right now I'm talking about the scientists and the doctors who are advocating these tests. The people that say these tests are 100% accurate. I would say more that they're 0% accurate. And the reason for that is this test contains what you call antigens. They are proteins from the HIV, the virus. And the principle of it is that the HIV proteins in the test kit are supposed to react with any kind of HIV antibodies that may be present in the person's blood sample. So the HIV antigens would react with the HIV antibodies. And theoretically, only HIV antibodies react with HIV antigens. Now, in reality, what really happens with antigens and antibodies is that they're not exclusive with each other. They're more promiscuous. In other words, antibodies will react with antigens that they don't belong to. In other words, let's say I have tuberculosis, and I have antibodies to the tuberculosis organism in my body, and I go out and take an HIV antibody test. What might happen is that my tuberculosis antibodies will cross-react with the antigens to HIV in the test kit, thereby giving a false positive. And these kind of cross-reactions are very, very common and very, very predictable as far as HIV antibody tests go.
That brings us to part one's conclusion. Hope you enjoyed it. Of course, next week at the same time, tune in when we take on part two, AIDS: A Second Opinion. I'm Gary Knoll. Have a good week, everyone.